I don't want to talk too much the entire time about the technology itself, but I'm sure not everyone talks about stress like me every day. So I wanted to kind of give an introduction on what is in situ stress, why we care about it, and what are conventional ways to measure it. And then we want to get into our project. How are we improving this, and how we have been validating this idea through laboratory and field experiments. Okay, so first the introduction. So why should we care about stress?
Recording in progress.
Recording, okay,
Yeah,
great.
sorry, I just started.
No problem.
Remove that.
Oh yeah, I see. There you go.
All right.
Great.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. So why should we care about stress? From a rock mechanical standpoint, which I do as my my field, stress is what drives deformation of material. Of course, you apply stress, that's what causes deformation. Here's a laboratory, on the top right is a laboratory collected stress strain curve of something that behaves brittle or ductile. In any case, this strain behavior is driven by stress, or, you know, of course, you can also argue that's vice versa. But anyways, stress is what makes things deform. And then, of course, if you ultimately stress this to the point that it fails, you'll see, as you see on the bottom right, rocks will fail by fracturing, or they might flow by distributed deformation. And of course, at the larger scale, these kind of deformation is what drives the mechanics of the Earth. You can have the ductile flow in the Earth is what's responsible for the convection of the mantle, which carries the plate that's residing on it. The plate moves, plate bump into each other. You get brittle fracturing at the boundary. That's how you create large earthquakes. So fundamentally, yes, stress is what drives everything. So if we want to understand the mechanics of these things, we got to characterize stress. Here's an engineering example of, in a shale gas hydraulic fracturing setting, why we care about stress. So in a shale gas production setting, we have a certain target reservoir region where we want to extract gas from. And as I think most of you know, we access the gas through hydraulic fracturing because the formation is very impermeable. And in order to open up these fractures, you have to pump the stress magnitude at that formation is what governs the pressure that's required to open the fracture. Now, the stress can be quite heterogeneous in the Earth, and in this particular case, the other interest is to keep the fracture in the target formation, because if you don't, you're going to fracture into the water-bearing reservoir formations, and you end up with a water well instead of a gas well. So for that, identification of a fracture barrier or a region where stress is high and prevent fracture propagation is very important. So here's a great example where understanding stress or measuring stress is crucial to successfully engineer this system. On the right, you also see a map view of the microseismic events that's induced by hydraulic fracturing. You can see the nice alignment of these events at different stages. Of course, this is lining against the regional direction of the horizontal stress. So stress direction, an example of how stress direction is crucial for predicting the behavior. I also want to motivate from the other end of the spectrum of geoscience. Shear stress on faults is what drives earthquakes. So on the top left, you see a distribution of slip along the fault that ruptured in the 1999 Chichi earthquake in Taiwan. And they can recover these slip distributions, the colorful picture you're seeing on the top left, by inverting seismic waves and figuring out what the slip should have been on the fault surface. So you can immediately tell how the distribution is heterogeneous. You have these high slip regions, the low slip regions. And then because of these patterns, right now the idea idea we have in the geoscience community is that, as I'm showing in the top right, the shear stress that's developed on the fault plains are also patchy, just like the SIP distribution. And then, can we really prove the link between this patchy stress distribution and patchy slip distribution? Here's a result of a numerical model, which is showing how the pattern is actually showing how the initial stress on the fault plane is patchy or not. Here's a case where it's more heterogeneous versus more smooth stress distribution. And then the contours are showing how the rupture front is propagating over time. And you can see the strong influence of the stress on the way things are propagating. So just to show you that, again, understanding stress is quite important if you want to properly, for instance, assess the seismic hazard in a earthquake fault situation. So stress is a tensorial property, so we can always make the discussion very complicated, but we're going to simplify the discussion by just focusing on the principal stresses. So stress in the earth, as shown in this cube in the middle, we can, as long as we are close to the surface, we can sort of simplify the discussion by saying that there are three principal stresses: vertical stress, and the two horizontal stresses. We call them SHmax and SHmin because one is greater than the other. As long as we characterize those three, we have an idea of the stress. The source of those stress, one is a gravitational body force. So as this column of rock just popped up, the weight of that rock above you is what is the main source of the vertical stress. And for that reason, stress will increase linearly with depth in a typical setting. Also, tectonic forces, which I kind of showed in the previous earlier slide, colliding of plates that move horizontally on the Earth's surface, they are also sources of horizontal stresses, and that's also superposed onto this vertical profile that I show on the top right. So SHmax and SHmin sometimes can be kind of variable because of these heterogeneous applications of tectonic forces. And of course, the relationship between those three principal stresses govern what kind of faulting you get. So anyways, this is what stress looks like at the shallow crustal region at the surface. And ideally, our objective is to characterize the magnitude of these three principal stresses and the direction of the horizontal stress, because that will then give us a complete picture of what the stress state is in the Earth. So what are the ways that we typically measure this in-situ stress? So as I just said about vertical stress is very easy to characterize. You just need to integrate the density profile. So if you know how your density changes with depth, you multiply by gravity, integrate with depth, you get the vertical stress profile, okay? And that's the most reliable stress calculation we can make. So that's easy, but then of course the challenge is how do we get the other two stress principal stresses, the SHmax and SHmin. So in geotechnical settings where the depth is not so great and where you go to measure the stresses, you can actually go to the underground situation. There are methods like flatjack or overcoring. These are various ways you can directly make a stress measurement by opening up fractures in a rock or measuring the deformation of the rock as you release the rock from the surrounding. But while these are good methods, if you want to go deeper down, because underground structures you can only build down to a couple kilometers, if you want to know the stress even deeper, you have to rely on borehole methods. So that's why in an energy resource setting, measurements in boreholes is going to be crucial. So how do we do things in the borehole? One popular method is shown in the cartoon on the left, which is hydraulic fracturing. So if you keep pumping fluid Okay, so first you inflate what's called a packer right here in order to isolate a segment between those two packers. And then you keep injecting fluid at high pressure until a fracture forms. And that pressure, and the pressure record example is shown in the middle bottom figure, where you can see how the increase in pressure kind of decreases because then when you also reopen the fracture, you only reach a certain pressure level because that's the pressure that is required to open the fracture corresponding to the minimum horizontal stress. Just for our audience who knows about this a little bit, I'm going to simplify everything today by saying we're only caring about vertical boreholes because when we talk about other geometries, it just adds parameters to our discussion. So we know how to get SV, that's by density. We know how to get SHmin, that's by hydraulic fracturing. But then the challenge is, how do we get SHmax? And that's the never-ending challenge. And but anyways, the current, one of the most robust ways that we measure this is by looking at borehole images. So you lower a tool that looks like the one on the top right. It's called a formation microimager. Basically, it scans how the rock looks like around the borehole using resistivity. And what you see on the bottom right is an unwrapped image of a borehole recovered by these tools. And what you can see here is these regions, band of dark regions, and maybe even these vertical hairline cracks that describe what we call wellbore failures. So what are these wellbore failures? These are actually, as the word suggests, where the rock has failed. So initially you have this king circular geometry because your drill bit rotates and you make a circular hole. But there are regions on the borehole wall where the rock collapsed due to the stresses that occur around the borehole. And you can see on the right, nice examples of this again. Breakouts appear as these fuzzy out of focus regions. Tensile fractures are these narrow hairline features that appear. And these what we'll focus on today is, of course, breakouts, because we're talking about thermal breakouts technology. And whether this happens or not, the important thing to realize is that whether we get these breakouts is up to how your stress on the borehole exceeds the rock stress. So the occurrence of these breakouts tell you that the stress was large enough to break the rock. So that's how you can back out the information about stress. A little bit more detailed quantitative view of this. Actually, this stress around the borehole wall, this is we're going to refer to it as hoop stress, sigma theta theta. This actually varies around the borehole depending on the direction. So what we're saying is that with the azimuth theta, the stress magnitude changes in this sinusoidal pattern. And so you can see that some regions you have a high stress and low stress, and this is because of the stress concentration you get because you take out the rock that used to fill the borehole. But anyways, because of this, you get this stress variation. And so, for instance, just as an example, if that is your rock strength, you can see that there's a region where it exceeds the rock strength. Therefore, within that azimuthal range, you're going to have rocks collapsing. And that's exactly what this region of breakout is. So this tells us that if we can understand the width of these breakouts, we can back out what this hoop stress pattern is, which is a function of the far field stresses, SHmax and SHmin. So remember, we have other methods to constrain SHmin in this equation. and also things like pressure. If we know the width of the breakout, we know what the hoop stress is when at the edge of this breakout. Therefore, we can solve for this sigma Hmax in order to constrain what this third principal stress is. So that's kind of a brief explanation of how stress measurement using breakouts work. So again, the advantage of this method is that you can apply this in boreholes, and as long as you can image the borehole. So of course you can't go down 20 kilometers, but at least you can do this measurement at depth beyond what geotechnical methods can do. And then again, with the breakouts can uniquely determine a single value for SHmax. Of course, discussions about error is always there, but in theory, you can do that. And if you combine it with hydraulic fracturing or density calculations, you can recover all three principal stresses. But of course, the big limitation is, what if you don't see breakouts or these drilling-induced tensile fractures? So if your horizontal stresses are such that the sinusoidal pattern does not exceed the rock strength, you're not going to see these breakouts, which means that you don't have information that allows you to calculate SHmax. So in that case, we don't gain any information for image logs. So that's where our idea of thermal breakout comes in. The idea is, if you don't see them, why don't we just make them? And this idea stems from, sorry, seems like okay. And this idea comes from a past project by a respect company that focused on trying to melt rocks around the borehole to seal the borehole. That's a pretty interesting idea. Anyways, under this project, they built this heater that they can put in the borehole, and you have to essentially heat it up to like 1,000 degrees to melt the rock. But the idea was that perhaps that's a way to seal the borehole in a setting like CO2 sequestration when you don't want leakage. So they were successful melting the rock, and you can see the re-solidified rock in the borehole on the right. But because what they were successful melting, but what they found out is that the heat caused the rocks to fracture. So the purpose was to seal the borehole, but because of the fracture that's caused by the heating, it kind of defies the purpose. So in a sense, they couldn't reach the final objective. But one thing that was clear is that these fractures seem to be happening because of the thermal stress that is caused by heating the borehole. So given that they had this background, it kind of merged with this idea of intentionally, that's how they came up with the idea of intentionally creating breakouts by heating. So how does this work, again, in this sinusoidal variation of hoop stress thing? So initially, you might have a stress variation in gray on the bottom, which does not meet the rock strength. Here, sorry, I forgot to label, but that's the strength of the rock in this scenario. Oh, it's labeled below, sorry. You can see that the gray hoop stress variation is below the 100, so you're not going to see breakouts. But if you increase the temperature of the borehole wall, you get this additional term in this hoop stress variation. Apologies that the cosine thing is gone, but anyways, the point is that there's an additional thermal stress term that goes into the hoop stress variation and shifts the whole hoop stress distribution up due to the thermal stress. After that, you can see in this schematic, you can reach the rock strength and then therefore create a breakout. So the first step is to be able to create a breakout, and just learning that it's there tells us the direction of stress. And then furthermore, if you can capture at what temperature the breakout starts to form, you can quantify the third stress magnitude, SHmax. So does this actually work? Here are some preliminary proof of concept experiments done in the lab and the field. And the first one I'm showing is experiments done by our colleague Seiji Nakagawa and Russ Yui. This was done in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It's called a shaped core experiment, where you can see on the top, this is kind of a cylindrical rock sample formed into an hourglass shape, okay? And the intention is that if you load on this sample, because of this specific geometry, you get this stress concentration around this curved region. And the idea is that this curved region is kind of like representative of what happens. It can replicate the stress concentration that happens around a circular borehole. So he loaded this sample in order to put stress concentrations in the curved area. And then he also used an infrared heater lamp, as you can see on the bottom right, in order to kind of spot heat this simulated borehole wall on the side. So the result I show here, what he did is he applied different axial stress, shown in red. So first there was almost no axial stress, then it was raised to 25, and then maybe 50, and then 75. And at each stress level, he did a heating to see if that produces rock failure. And he monitors, of course, visually by looking at whether the rock kind of falls on the side, and also by looking at acoustic emission, which is listening to the cracking sound during rock failure. So what this result shows is that the first two times he heated, you didn't see anything break, but then the third and fourth time, when there was more stress, you saw that you saw this signal of rock failure. So this tells us that this thermal heating and thermal stress does help to induce breakouts where it didn't used to exist. And the onset of this occurrence of breakout is actually a function of the far field stress that's applied to this rock. So it's pretty hopeful. The next thing that was done is preliminary field testing at the Stanford Underground Research Facility. You guys know this place? Yes? No? This is a mine that was developed, it's in South Dakota. I'm trying to say it's a gold mine, I think it is. Abandoned gold mine, yes. That was converted into an underground science laboratory. And there's a whole, I'll show you in a minute, but it's excavated quite impressively. But anyways, there are regions where we can access it at depth, where you get this earth stress magnitude in the rock. And there were some boreholes that were drilled in the past, so we wanted to use those boreholes to kind of test if heating does indeed induce breakouts. So this is kind of a 3D view of what this excavation looks like. These spots are where we went to kind of test this technology. This geometry is actually showing a borehole and fractures that were created by another project, but we were just borrowing these boreholes to insert like a heating tool and see if that can induce breakouts. So here's some photos from the actual field experiment. So you see those boreholes right here, it's colored in yellow. And then we stuck this borehole heater to try to see if it works. So this is another view. This is kind of a cross section of the excavation itself, and the yellow is the borehole that's kind of, not sure if it's actually going up. Maybe it's the way, the perspective thing, but anyways, there were 4 intervals that were heated by what our colleagues call it a garage tool. Actually, I think it's pretty, successful, but anyways, In order to ensure that the tool is centered properly, there were these PVC pipes that were added so that you lift it and just put it in the center. And you can see the heater element in the middle. That's what's going to heat the borehole. And on the right, you can see some temperature measurements of the heater element itself and also the borehole wall. I must admit, I actually forgot how this borehole wall temperature is collected, but I think this is accessible enough. The borehole is right in front of you, so they had ways to do that. Maybe put a thermocouple just laying on the borehole, the bottom side of the borehole. And as a result, what they found is that yes, they did actually see the wall of the borehole break. So you can see in test one these regions. You see evidence of a broken borehole wall. You also see it in test 2. Test 3, you only see it on the bottom right. Test 4, you also see it only on the top left right here. But sure enough, you can clearly see the contrast between where it wasn't heated and where it was heated. This did actually induce breakouts. And then here's again a borehole image that's unwrapped, showing all 4 intervals. The point is that these breakouts are occurring at the same orientation. Or if you want to see, in a cross-sectional view, it's always happening at this orientation. And that's significant because we know breakouts occur in a particular orientation in relation to the in-situ stress direction. So, the fact that we're recovering something consistent means that assuming the stress is unchanged throughout this interval, we're actually recovering the orientation of the stress. And this is also supported by other information in the other project. The same thing was done at the 4850 level. And you can study these fragments to kind of also learn about how the mode of the failure. Anyways, this is all good information. We understand that this idea of thermal breakout works. If you heat the borehole, you will form breakout at the location you would expect that is governed by the in-situ stress. So we can actually recover additional information. So the qualitative side is now kind of validated. So we wanted to get into a little bit more quantitative validation of this idea. So this is where our group in UW-Madison kind of contributed through performing these true triaxial borehole experiments. So how is the experiment done? This is a true triaxial apparatus that was originally made by Professor Haimson. What you can see in the middle is the load frame with the pressure chamber in the middle. There's a blow up of the pressure chamber looking from the top. You can see there's a square void. That's where you put the sample. And you can see 16 samples here of Urea sandstone and Niagara dolomite, approximately 5 by 5 by 8 inches big. And then the borehole is, I think, 1 inch, or actually it might be a 0.75 inch in diameter. So what this does is that by putting this rock in this pressure chamber, the pressure chamber can apply stress from 2 directions. And we call that that represents the SHmax and the SHmin. And then once you put this pressure chamber into the frame will load in the 3rd direction, which gives us the SV. So we can control the stress that's applied to the rock, and then see if this technology or methodology can recover the stress that's applied to the rock. Some additional things we did is on the top left, you can see these red dots. These are acoustic emission sensors. This is to listen the onset of the breakout. There's also arrays of thermocouples, 12 of them drilled and located close to the borehole in order to measure the temperature in the rock. So the first step, first experiment we did is the room temperature test. And, first we wanted to just, without any heat, produce breakouts in these rocks. So the objective is to, because we know the rock strength of these rocks, are we getting breakouts at where we expect? The procedure is that first you increase all principal stresses, and then after you hold the vertical stress constant, you only increase the two horizontal stresses. And then at a certain point, in this case, when the SHmin reaches 20 megapascal, you only load on the third axis, sigma Hmax, until this thing breaks. And of course, if you use the Kirsch solution with the sinusoidal variation, you can actually calculate what the corresponding hoop stress at the borehole wall is as we change these stress magnitudes. And then what we see first, as I'm showing in the bottom, is that at some point you see a rapid occurrence of acoustic emission suggesting breakout occurrence. And I see. What we also did with the room temperature experiment is actually to put a camera inside to check how the breakout is occurring. And this is a long video, about 4 minutes. I'm sure. I won't show the whole thing. Let me change the configuration so I can. So as you can see in the numbers there, the stress is gradually increasing. The first thing we see is that in the sandstone experiment, we see these grains kind of plucking out of the rock. Okay, there you go. And then as you keep increasing, the snowing of sand grains keep going, but then you start to see this emergence of breakouts kind of forming here and down here. And let's speed up the process. So you kind of nicely see how this gradually occurs. So, this was a neat confirmation that, breakouts are occurring somewhere in the middle of the experiment. And moreover, very importantly, sorry, I'm trying to navigate my cursor. The onset of this acoustic emission is actually corresponding to when we start seeing this breakout. And I have another movie. This one's much shorter. This is the one in Niagara Dolomite. You don't see so much of that snowing. Well, you do a little bit, but then this one's, I'm not even fast forwarding. It's quite dramatic how it occurs, right? Just thought it's a cool movie to show. So you see the same thing with Niagara Dolomite. When we locate these acoustic emission events, because we have 12, actually in this case, 8 sensors, we can kind of do like a miniature scale seismology to locate where these cracking sounds are coming from. These do occur at the regions where we expect. And furthermore, as we'll talk about later, the identification of the onset of this breakout is actually quite important. So we further figured out that if we classify these acoustic emission by different source type, C for compression, shear for S for shear, and T for tensile, we learned that the onset of the tensile events is actually what best corresponds to when the breakout occurs. And that's because when these breakouts occur, these are kind of rocks falling off, so it makes sense. But one problem we learned is that, the stress at which this breakout is occurring is drastically different from what we expected. So on the left is showing triaxial strength test of Barra sandstone in Niagara Dolomite. So these are stress magnitudes at rock failure measured at different confining pressure. And I'm sure you've heard of Moore-Coulomb criterion. you can fit a line in order to calculate or estimate what the rock strength is. Oops. What the rock strength is at zero confining pressure. And that's the rock strength that's relevant to our setting, because at the borehole wall, one of your principal stress is 0. So those values were roughly 70 and say 250. What we learned from the timing at which these breakouts form is that the hoop stress when these breakouts happen were for sandstone around 130, and then for nitrogen and dolomite 400. And that's, almost a factor of 2 or more compared to the rock strength that we measured in the lab. And that was a very big puzzle. But we learned that this is actually not the first time it's observed. It's the well-known size effect of rock strength, which is complicating this interpretation. So what you're seeing in the bottom right is a paper by Tobias Meyer, who is showing what happens as the borehole diameter change from 0 to 20 millimeters. And the vertical axis is the critical tangential stress. That's the hoop stress at rock failure divided by the uniaxial compressive strain, like the one right here. So if everything fails at this expected value, this ratio should be 1. But you see how all of these data points that's compiled from the literature is quite different, right? And it tells us how rock mechanics is so complicated. Even just predicting the simple rock strength is so involved. And you can see that in some cases, as you go for a small borehole diameter, the factor becomes quite dramatic, close to 10. So this is probably the reason why we're observing this large discrepancy between the expected stress at breakout occurrence and the strain. There's really no way of robustly estimating this size effect. So what we said is that, okay, fine, this is much higher than what we expect, but let's just regard these numbers from these room temperature as what we call BCS, is a borehole compressive strain. In this setting, as long as we don't change the borehole diameter of our future experiment, we can regard this to be the strength of the rock. So the next step is to do a heated test, because we're interested in thermal breakouts. So the objective here is that we want to check if breakouts occur at the same hoop stress, when hoop stress is caused by the far field stress plus the thermal stress. So on the top right is the procedure of a regular room temperature experiment, but in a heated experiment, what we did is we didn't raise the final sigma H, the red one, until the breakout forms. Well, we kept it constant. And then after we reached that stress state, we had a heater that is inserted to the borehole, and we turn it on to heat the borehole, induce temperature change, and then induce thermal stress, as shown in this last term. So here's a result. After we turn on the heater, what you're seeing on the second plot here is the temperature data that's collected by the array of thermocouples. And sure enough, you're seeing that the temperature is increasing over time. And then as you turn off the heater, the temperature decreases, of course. And the reason why the increase in temperature is different is because these thermocouples are embedded at different distance from the borehole. So the question is, one thing to note is that these measurements are not the borehole temperature, because these are a little bit, few millimeters away from the borehole. But this delta T is for the borehole temperature. So we have to somehow back out what the borehole temperature is. So when we plot the temperature measurement at a particular time, as a function of distance from the borehole wall, we see this nice curve that shows at the beginning, the temperature is flat, but But then after 100 seconds, you see an increase in temperature closer to the borehole. And then this keeps increasing, okay? And we try to do a thermal conduction modeling to see what kind of boundary condition explains this temperature distribution. We tested constant heat flux. We also tested linear increase in heat flux. Turns out linear increase in heat flux is what best explains this temperature distribution. So using that solution, we can back out what the temperature at the borehole wall is. So now that we know delta T, we can use delta T. Oh, by the way, sorry, I forgot to mention, this is Young's modulus, and this is your Poisson's ratio, and alpha is your thermal expansion coefficient. So you can use the delta T to calculate the thermal stress, which gets added onto the hoop stress contribution coming from the stress applied by the equipment. So on the bottom right now, you see how there's the red stress increase due to the equipment, and then due to the heating is what's shown after that. Again, the distribution of acoustic emissions are expected. I'll skip this because this is just the same. And then in this case, we don't have a borehole camera because we have the heater in position. So we can't really see when the breakout started to occur. So that's why we are actually testing this acoustic emission monitoring. So in this case, we're going to rely on the acoustic emission to identify when the breakout starts to happen, because the timing at when this breakout happens gives us the temperature at when this happens, and therefore also the thermal stress term at the onset of breakout. So now that we know all the terms that make up the hoop stress at the onset of breakout, our final step is to solve for sigma Hmax, just a very simple algebraic manipulation, in order to calculate what is the estimated sigma Hmax from the thermal breakout experiment. And on the right, we're plotting the cross plot of the actual applied horizontal stress on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis is what we recover from our temperature measurements in the thermal breakout method. So you can see that there is a first order success. Yes, you are predicting roughly the correct trend where the predicted value goes up as the applied value goes up. But there is definitely a consistent trend of over prediction of the sigma Hmax compared to what is applied. And all the details of why this occurs is a quite complicated discussion. But one of the things we think is crucial is the fact that we're just using a simple Moore-Coulomb criterion. Moore-Coulomb criterion is only a relationship between sigma 1 and sigma 3. Well, it's not friction coefficient. Let's just say it's a constant K or something. But we know from rock mechanics testing that the intermediate stress, sigma 2, also has an influence on rock strength. In the borehole setting, the sigma 2 is the vertical stress. That's the stress that is applied parallel to the borehole axis. And that is certainly non-zero. And we think that is what's contributing to the increase in the apparent the strength of these rocks. So I'm just going to go over this very quickly, but because the details are still in discussion. But so we are looking at true triaxial criteria, Nadai criteria, and Mogi criteria, in order to see if these true triaxial strength data, rock strength criterion can help explain this discrepancy. So far, we must say that there's not much success. There still exists a discrepancy between our predicted stress versus applied stress. And why does this happen? again, is still kind of a preliminary interpretation. But one thing is that we know that these true triaxial strength criteria, some criteria works for some rocks, other criteria works better for other rocks, and identifying why that happens is kind of the outstanding question in the literature still. And we also think that simply this geometrical effect, this discrepancy between the strength of a cylindrical rock and a cylindrical hole, that difference in geometry probably has some influence as well. So that's something we are still working on. So to summarize the lab testing, we are somewhat successful. We are successful creating a thermal breakout. I would say in the quantitative sense, we have a first